Hi, I'm John Paul, and I really want to welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm delighted to be talking about ethical considerations and obligations. It's not something I've really spoken about on the channel before, maybe in a few bits about setting up a private practice, but I think it's really something that's worth having much more of a look at. And when I say I'm talking about it, I'm delighted to have back on Michael Toller, who you may have seen came on previously to talk about his career change, and also how he sets up his portfolio career now, particularly talked about as well his Clinical Will app. And it was in relation to that, actually, that this issue of ethical considerations and obligations came up. It's a particular area, I think, that's of interest to Michael. Well, I guess as it should be to all therapists. But thank you for coming back on, Michael, to talk about this.
Great. Thank you very much for having me again.
That's okay. And just to start, as I say, you did mention before that it was something that's of particular interest to you. So could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. I think, like any therapist or counselor that, is training or getting started or has been working for a while, it's obviously something we're, I guess, asked to think about a lot through our training. And then, the way we supervised and CPD, like we are encouraged to think about ethical practice for a really good reason, which I guess, we'll kind of come to in due course. I think in the same way that anyone might have thought about it, I did when I was training and started working. And then there was a point, and if any of your listeners listened to the other episode we recorded, where I started thinking about clinical wills specifically, because I needed to set one up for my own practice. Mm-hmm. Thought a lot about those. And it was really through that experience that I guess sort of stood back and thought about ethical practice in more detail in relation to sort of all the parts of the practice and how I work and how I set up various sort of parts of my practice. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I guess I've thought about generally, but then really specifically through the kind of interest in clinical wills, and felt that there was a lot more to kind of think about and to find out about, which I've sort of gone on to do, setting up that platform, and then in relation to that, talking to a lot of colleagues and other therapists and counselors, and really realizing that there's a lot to think about. And maybe that's why we're coming into this podcast, because if someone asks me what is it about ethical practice that you know or that you found out, my first answer would probably be, well, there's quite a lot actually to think about that maybe I wasn't aware of before I kind of did that extra thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And it is that thing, isn't it, that because if you're working in private practice, you're working on your own, really. I mean, we'll come to supervision and that kind of thing. But fundamentally, you really are on your own. So all of these ethical issues, it's something I've said in the past that I think could be a challenge about being a therapist, which is the kind of where the right and wrong answers are with a lot of it. There are some things which clearly for many people would be or the majority of therapists would be a no or a yes. And of course, we have these ethical codes which do set out a number of different provisions in terms of the kind of things that we're going to be talking about supervision. But it's really important to have these conversations, I think, as well, isn't it? Because we are mostly sitting in a room with clients on our own. I also thought it was worth mentioning that at the end of last week, I saw some articles, which I'll post below the video, actually, in The Guardian, on the kind of increase in complaints about therapists. It's gone up sort of 25% since 2021, 2022, something like that. Various things, people perhaps acting outside of their areas of competence, diagnosing things which perhaps they shouldn't. And these are all ethical considerations, aren't they? So perhaps we might come to some of them. Working within the limits of competence is one of them.
I think so. And I think those articles, because I saw them too, and I think as did many of our fellow practitioners, certainly people I've been talking to, they've really reminded people not only of the importance of ethical practice, and I think this is in a way the reason why we're here is why we do this work and why we're talking about it, is that ethical practice is about doing something that's good for our clients. Ultimately, I mean, we're here to support our clients in the various ways that we are, and ethical practice really is a way of helping us to do that, I think. And I think it's really important that we remember that the point of it really is it's about the clients that we work with and looking after them, as well as looking after ourselves in order to do that work properly. And that's the sort of the starting point. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think sometimes that doesn't happen because of oversight. And sometimes it happens because, in the way things are set up currently, per the articles that you mentioned, You know, in a way, anyone can call themselves a therapist or a counselor. And, you know, that's one sort of thing, one problem to discuss. But the other is that that probably means that they're not thinking about what it means to do this work well. And that then brings us back to, you know, accredited trainings and membership organizations who have thought about that and have these codes that we, you know, need to be aware of for a very good reason. So I think if we sort of start with that idea that it's about the clients, and working with them, as you say, you know, within our competence and responsibly in a way that's beneficial to them, that's really what ethical practice is about and what those codes are there for. And that they then have, that's sort of the maybe the way into thinking about ethical practice, and not just why it's important, but then why we do certain things and don't do other things.
And perhaps looking at some specifics, one of the key ethical obligations, I think, across all the different regulating bodies, an obligation for supervision. From that point of view, I mean, I can absolutely see why that's the case. I mean, of course, supervision, I would use it for discussing specific things with clients, all, of course, on an anonymous kind of no names basis. But also, I think supervision can be good from the point of view of talking about anything that might be affecting you and your client work generally. For me, it's such an important thing. My UKCP, they require a sort of certain ratio within the first 5 years, which I think is 1 to 5 hours. And they say it's got to be vertical. So it's got to be somebody who's got a supervision qualification. After the 5 years, I don't know if it's the same for you. At that point, it can be horizontal, so it can be peer supervision.
I see.
That you have. You know, I think it's invaluable to get other people's views on what's happening. The only thing that I would say about it is when I was reading 1 or 2 of the cases where people have come forward for complaints, and somebody who had, for example, sexual contact with a client and has been, you know, paying damages of a couple of £100,000. I doubt very much they were telling their supervisor what was happening for them in life. And I know that's quite an extreme example, but the thing I suppose that I would say about supervision is that it's important to be being as open as possible about what's happening. There could be a tendency perhaps not to say it. So it does require, doesn't it, that sort of open communication with the supervisor, therefore somebody who's very much trusted.
And look, I think it's a really good point you make, because, you know, I think supervision is one of those things where you get out as much as you put in, and in a way that starts with the practitioner. In a way, all of it starts with the practitioner deciding to, you know, work ethically, and, you know, in a way you can't legislate for that. I mean, you could legislate around titles and about, you know, protecting titles and making sure that people are trained in a certain way before they can call themselves a therapist or a counselor. But you know, even then, you know, people make mistakes, or you know, or worse, set out to kind of cause harm. And in a way, you can't legislate for that. I guess all you can do is, you know, set up a system that is sort of set up to encourage and people to work as ethically as possible. But in the first instance, we have to decide to do that. And I think the ethical codes and understanding them, you know, all the membership bodies have an ethical code. All the big ones that you might expect a therapist or a counselor to be part of have an ethical code, and in a way they're the starting point. I think sort of reading those and making yourself familiar with them and taking them really seriously as a really kind of useful guide to how to work ethically is the first point. And then I think I agree with you that supervision in a way is the next thing. And I think, having heard what you've just said there, what you've reminded me of is that, you know, in a way, all the things we can do to help us work ethically, they're not kind of one-off events. I mean, some of them we might focus on more sometimes than others, but in a way, all of them, and particularly supervision, it's about kind of ongoing. It's not a one-off event. It's something we do on an ongoing basis, which is why we have regular supervision. And, you know, the different bodies will define what you know, adequate supervision is. And I think you're right. You know, the vertical and the horizontal is interesting. I do both, so it's not either or. I do a one-on-one clinical supervision quite regularly. I think more than I sort of need to per the guidelines in my ethical code, but I also do a peer supervision, and I find that really useful. Maybe for, you know, more of the kind of what it's like for me to practice as a person with other things going on in my life, and that's sort of where I take that in terms of how I think about, you know, how I use supervision for different supervisions for different things. But the point I'm really trying to make is that it's something that I do on a regular basis, and in the same way that, you know, more generally, I think about ethical practice as an ongoing process rather than something I need to think about once.
You know, challenge can be important in supervision, can't it? There can be a tendency, I was going to talk about it when we come on to CPD actually. Therapists do tend to be pretty supportive bunch, don't we? Which is the one of the lovely things about being in the profession, I think. But of course, there is something about supervision as well, as it does provide the opportunity more for the challenge, doesn't it? Therapists will often challenge themselves. So I think we might be a personality type where we do think about things, perhaps worry too much. Some people sometimes, but it's also a great opportunity for to hear other people's views and approaches, and they can be very, very different.
Yeah, I think the way I understand that, it's an opportunity to think together, which, you know, I think is what a lot of the time we offer our clients, is an opportunity to think together about something that's happening in their life, maybe in a way that they haven't thought about it. And I think supervision is a similar opportunity for us as therapists and counselors to think together with someone else who might have a different take or a different perspective, or remind us of something that we're not thinking about, and you know, to sort of step into a sort of a thinking space in which we can do some, you know, useful thinking together. Yeah.
So supervision, I mean, how about some specific?
Having said that, you know, there's an ongoing sort of, I mean, I think anything that relates to ethical practice has to be thought about in an ongoing sort of way. And, you know, anything we do kind of can be thought about again and again and maybe revised. Having said that, I think there are some things, maybe particularly when people are sort of starting out, you know, particularly when they're setting up by themselves in private practice, that sort of need thinking about more at certain times. And I'm relating my own experience. So the point where I set up, you know, I went and found a supervisor. That was the first thing I did. And I, you know, thought with them about what it was I needed to do. And a few things, single event items came up, which was things like finding insurance and, you know, taking it out. And then obviously I renew it every year, but I had to do that for the first time at one point. So sort of researching that and understanding what the insurance is for and how it works, and, you know, what it covers and why. And then similarly, you know, getting some agreements, and I guess we could talk about agreements or contracts together. And, you know, I guess I had a version of that then, which I've gone on to develop, but I've had to think about it for the first time at one point. And then, you know, something I should have done at that point but didn't, and did later, was creating my clinical will as well, which, you know, obviously now through the work I've done, I realize is really, really important. And but it's also often overlooked because maybe it seems less kind of pressing than, you know, an agreement that you can give to a client. And but you know, I'll sort of really underline the fact now that I think it's a really important thing to do before you start working with clients, you know, for reasons that we can go into if we want to now. But so maybe those things are things that kind of need a particular attention at a particular time. But again, just to reiterate that I go back and review those. You know, I have client agreements that I revise, and I also have a privacy policy or notice now that, you know, I kind of revise as well and update, I mean, as and when I need to. And that's because I find out more as I go on, and you know, maybe I have overlooked something that needs including there or mentioning there. For example, the clinical will in relation to GDPR. When I started thinking about clinical wills, I went and read about GDPR. You know, there's a lot of information at the ICO. That's another thing people need to do, I think, up front, is register with the ICO and make themselves aware of GDPR and what that means in terms of their practice. And what I learned then was that if we have a clinical will, then we're sharing information about clients, or potentially sharing information about clients with our clinical trustee. And we need to tell our clients that. So GDPR says that if we hold information about clients, they know what they should be told, what we hold and why, and what we might do with that. So we also need to tell clients that we'll be potentially discussing them in supervision with our supervisor, because in a way that's information that relates to them. So that's just GDPR says we need to be doing that. And I didn't know that, and I found that out, and I've sort of incorporated that into my practice. And that's included updating my privacy notice and my agreements, just to tell people that, which GDPR requires me to do.
Sure. Okay. I mean, just looking at some of the specifics in order then. I mean, the first one we mentioned was insurance. You very impressively said that you'd read the provisions for your insurance contract.
More or less.
Did you? But when I obviously I took it out. This does sound like an odd thing for an ex-lawyer to say, but it would be one of those things that I know that has to be in place, and of course have it in place every year. By the way, mine would cost roughly £60 a year, something like that. I don't know, you know, it's not that expensive to put.
It's not. Mine's a little bit more than that. I think just at some point I decided to up the sort of the level of cover. I don't know why I did that, but maybe I was feeling a bit sort of risk averse and decided to sort of pay a bit more for more risk.
Yes, I mean, so insurance for people that don't know who are setting up their practices, it's professional indemnity insurance, isn't it?
Yeah.
He says, having taken a policy out
Yeah.
every year for the last 12 years. So it would be that if claims are made against therapists.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
mean, from that point of view, it has to be in place, doesn't it? And I can see why it is in place, because the potential risk of something happening would be so significant financially for a therapist. Well, and of course, it's to protect the client as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I haven't really heard necessarily of people claiming on their insurance. I do remember somebody who had a complaint actually, and I think there's sort of a like quasi-legal process through BACP to deal with complaints, and I think they got a solicitor actually involved, and I think that was their legal fees were covered by their insurance. I think that's the case. But other than that, I haven't really heard of anybody like having to claim under their insurance. I just don't know from your point of view.
I haven't either. I'm sure if we, hit Google and start looking for it, we'd probably find cases where therapists have, had to get an insurance company involved. But I think you're right. It may not be, there may be sort of other ways that people, need to involve their insurance company, and it might be around, a complaint and legal fees, which I know that are covered by insurances. I think anecdotally, I've also heard of situations in relation to clinical wills, and again, having had lots of conversations with that, where things have got complicated, after a therapist has maybe died or got ill in relation to data. And I think, insurance companies, that's part of what they're insured against is, data breaches as well, because that's sort of potentially a problem which might then involve some kind of third party kind of support as well, with costs attached.
Okay.
And, things can go wrong. People can get hacked, or, it might be that, a system you use gets hacked, and sort of thinking through potential situations like that.
Interesting. I hadn't really thought of that actually. Yeah. So, I mean, should we talk about the Clinical Will app and that ethical obligation as well? And so yes, and particularly in relation, we know we're going to perhaps say something about data protection and that kind of thing. So yes, of course, there is the potential, isn't there, of some sort of claim or a problem arising as a result of information getting out there, confidential client information.
Yeah, or clients have the right to have the information that's held on them deleted. And if you sort of think it through, I mean, part of what a clinical will might be set up to do is to enable a trustee to delete client records after a therapist has died. So it's not even just about contacting clients. Yeah, but it might be a provision for having data deleted by a person who is sort of appropriately positioned to do that, which wouldn't be a family member or even a solicitor necessarily. It might need to be someone who we think is appropriate to see information on our clients, for example. Okay. Depending on where that's held. And if you sort of think it through, if provision hasn't been made for that, then that data might just be sitting somewhere kind of inaccessible, which a client might really have a problem with. And that might then be a problem, I guess, for a therapist's estate, if you have a client who's trying to kind of get that data deleted, but no one knows how to access it.
Sure. Okay. I mean, perhaps we could talk about how the Clinical Will app provides for something to be accessed. But generally, I'm aware that if somebody's a practicing therapist, they'll know what a clinical will is. Yeah. For somebody who's just starting out, they might have an idea of it. But could you just say a bit about what the will's there for?
Yeah, so really easy way to understand it is that we have an obligation, obviously, ethically, to look after our clients. Part of that's to do with endings, and usually in a piece of work we're doing with someone, we manage an ending and end a piece of work appropriately. There are instances where therapists can get ill suddenly or even die, in which that's not possible. So a clinical will is set up. It's more than just a document. It's a process really that a therapist sets up in advance to anticipate an event like that happening, where they nominate a colleague to take responsibility for, at the very least, contacting their clients in the event that the therapists themselves can't do so, and letting a client know that their therapist needs to take a break in the work, or if a therapist dies suddenly, that the work won't be continuing. And then beyond that, a clinical will can also make provision for that colleague, the clinical trustee, is then known to maybe wrap up other parts of the therapist's business if that's what the therapist wants them to do. So that's in a sort of a very high level overview of what that is. So there's a document there with information in it, which is at the very least the clients contact, the sort of the caseload, the a list of the therapist's clients and their contact details.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, any other information that the therapist wants to include for their colleague to access. And then if we get into sort of GDPR, obviously that information is, I guess, sort of clinically sensitive because it relates to people in therapy. So it wouldn't be appropriate for a family member or even, a sort of a non-therapeutic professional to carrying out those tasks. So if I know this because I've looked at them all, but all the ethical codes state that it needs to be someone who's appropriate to do that, which in my understanding would be someone who's qualified, but not just qualified, also experienced enough as a clinical practitioner to take that on and be calling clients and then maybe wrapping up those other parts of a therapist's practice.
Okay.
So that information needs to be stored securely enough for anyone else not to access it, but it needs to be easily accessible by the nominated colleague. And that then is what Clinical Will app is about. So we don't need to go into that in detail, but it basically makes that really easy for practitioners to do, and then for the right person to access the right information at the right time, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to be doing well, the app?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, lots of people are using it. And, I think I've been really, having sort of been made aware of what a clinical will is and thought about it for myself, and then, trying to find a kind of ultimately a solution for myself to make provision for that. It's been really kind of gratifying to see that I've helped other people think about it and take it seriously, and whether they use the app or not, to realize that clinical wills are really important, and that it's something they should pay attention to before it's too late, if you like, and to sort of engage with that and to set something up, because and also to sort of show them that it's not as difficult as they think it might be. I mean, administratively it can feel like a bit of a pain, but actually it doesn't take a lot of work if you find the sort of the system that works for you. And it's something that's quite easy sort of to set up and then sort of maintain on an ongoing basis.
I mean, when I first started, I don't think there was an arrangement for a clinical will.
Right.
I don't know what people would have done.
Yeah, well, I mean, I spoke to, so a few years ago, and I was thinking about this in relation to how I would do it. I spoke to quite a lot of colleagues, and, there were certainly people who were leaving hard copy lists in, secure places. But then, I was sort of thinking, well, how easy is that to update or even access, when you need to? And yeah, that sort of led me down the road of thinking, well, there's got to be a kind of a better solution. And, these days, digital solutions, are often very useful, and, sort of putting two and two together and realizing there was a digital version of a clinical will that might make the whole thing kind of easier for people to use. But yeah, I think people were sort of having a good go at it, but maybe, it wasn't always being done as well as it could be. And, part of what I've sort of tried to do is to make it really easy for colleagues to
fantastic. I mean, we'll put a link below to the video so that people can
Sure.
click through and have a look at that. But I mean, just looking at some other provisions, you mentioned actually using contracts and agreements. So having an initial, I would call mine a framework agreement, actually, that's put in place that a client agrees to at the beginning of therapy. I guess main provisions that would be within that would be things like confidentiality, carve-outs confidentiality, cancellation policy was always important, isn't it? Because I think there is something, confidentiality would tend to cross through, all therapists would say something very similar, because some of them are required by law, aren't they? But things like cancellation, it's interesting the difference in people's policies. So, I mean, I would know one therapist who clients pay for every single week apart from when they're on holiday. So there isn't really a cancellation policy necessary there, that they notify the client when they're not there, and the client doesn't pay for that. And then other people would have, say, 24-hour cancellation. So if a client cancels outside of 24 hours, then they don't have to pay for the session. So it is, from the kind of ethical obligations and those things. That's one thing about the profession that I do notice as well, is people do decide on their own ways of working, which can mean flexibility, and but it also means that it can be quite difficult, I think, to decide where you sit on that.
I agree with you. So I think what you've touched on there is something you mentioned before. There are some things in a way that are absolutes, and I think the ethical codes are a great place to start. So they will all say, confidentiality is an absolute priority and sort of non-negotiable. And, I mean, it almost doesn't even need saying, but it's there in all the ethical codes for a really good reason, because in a way that's the sort of the foundation, I think, of any kind of sort of therapeutic space, if you like, to give the client a space in which they really feel they can bring whatever they want to, and that's sort of fundamental to the work we do. Beyond that, there is a lot of I guess flexibility, and practitioners doing things in different ways, and cancellations, or how fees are paid, or even what they are. I think if you start talking to people, you'll realize there's a lot of different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is if you think about the ethical codes, there's nothing in there about that, because that's up to the practitioners themselves to decide. But what you'll find is in there is that whatever it is should be communicated clearly to a client. So I think that, if you think about what we're required to do ethically, that will be in the codes. It'll say something like, talk to your clients about it. So my agreement is not just a document that I give them that they sign. It's also a conversation we have when we're starting to work together, and an opportunity for them to ask me questions. But certain things that I think it's really important to be upfront about, particularly around fees or cancellations or holidays, and how I think about those. And it's something I'll discuss with my clients. So that's something that I'm choosing to do because I think it's an ethical thing to do, and a really important part of ethical practice.
Yes, making it very clear, those terms, as exactly. You say, because some clients, when they're or some other therapists, when they hear the amount that some therapists charge, I don't know if they think it's an ethical issue, but perhaps they do. That some people who are charging hundreds of pounds an hour, they think there's an ethical issue there. But as you say, I don't think the code say anything about that. They also, I don't think, say much about how many clients somebody should see, because of course that is dependent on the person, their tolerances, the kind of clients that they see, the kind of psychography of their clients as well. I think there's all sorts of different variables there, aren't there? Which means I can see why the ACP or UKCP don't say, well, you can't see any more than X number of clients. I'm sure it's covered by other things about self-care and not doing harm and those things. But
I think that's where I would, if the way I would think about it, that's where I think you'll find that those things refer to, that we also have a responsibility as practitioners to look after ourselves. Now, whether that's not working with too many clients, or taking on too many complex cases, or also that we charge, particularly if we're working in private practice, that we charge fees that allow us to run our private practices. And, fundamentally to pay our bills as well. My private practice is the business, and, it's where I earn my income. So part of my thinking around fees is that it needs to support me, because if I don't feel like, I'm able to pay my bills, then I'm not going to be able to do the work I do properly. So in a way, it's part of ethical practice to charge fees that allow you to do the work.
Sure.
And you may not see that written sort of in direct, explicit terms in the ethical codes, but it will be talking about self-care, and I think that it's one part of self-care. As well as maybe not working too much, or also making sure that we manage other things that are going on in our lives, either directly through therapy that we might be in, or indirectly through other ways that we kind of look after ourselves.
Yeah, because I guess the tolerances and capacity change depending on what's going on in life. Somebody's got a new baby or menopause, those kind of things that might change the number of clients they see. But in terms of the actual practicalities of it, you do a written document, do you? I email one through actually, and they would just confirm by email that they're happy with that. But
I have a PDF that I email, and I ask my clients to acknowledge they've read it, and to sort of send that back to me, to send the acknowledgement back to me, and also invite them to ask me any questions, because I think it's I think part of, again, the way I think about practicing ethically is that if they have any questions or doubts about the way we're going to work, that they have an opportunity to ask me about it, which they sometimes do.
I just wonder, one of the ethical obligations would be upholding those kind of ethical standards in public, and we are on a social media platform. YouTube would be, wouldn't it, I guess? So taking in social media, I think that's something that will be around a lot. My sense would be, for people starting out in practice, when I started out, very few therapists would be on social media. Some of the social media platforms weren't even there. And maybe I'm not that old, but they definitely weren't there in the way that they are. A lot of people, I think, would factor in, certainly their website, but also what social media platforms they're going to be on. So I think that's an important one, really, to look at.
I think it's really, really important. As far as I'm aware, the BPC actually offers some sort of formal guidance on that. So it's something they ask their members to be aware of. and to think about. And it's something that, again, it's not a sort of not a one-off event to think about that. I think it's an ongoing thing. I mean, I'm on various social media, on Facebook, and I'm aware that there are a lot of therapists on Facebook. There are a lot of therapy and counseling specific Facebook groups where therapists are supporting each other and asking for advice, helping each other out in various ways.
Yeah.
And I think it's it's really important to think about how we appear, not just to other therapists and counselors and colleagues in that sense, but potentially also to potential clients, depending on where we're posting and what we're posting, or even on a website. Or that we sort of make sure that we remember that what we post, in social media, I mean, obviously, if it's a public forum, that anyone could read it. I mean, that's really important. A client might come across something we've said. And I guess it takes us back to thinking about, what we do as therapists in sessions with clients. And, again, different therapists think about this in different ways. But I work psychodynamically, and, that means I choose not to disclose a lot for reasons to do with the approach that I work in, because not disclosing facts about my life allows for something to happen in the room with my client. If you go on I don't know, Twitter or Facebook, and you're in a kind of public bit of that, and you disclose things about your life, I mean, even if it's just pictures, a client might come across that. And I think we have to think about that for ourselves in relation to how we work. So I'm quite careful now with what I sort of post publicly for that reason, but for reasons to do with the fact that my clients are out there, and they might be, they might either come across me by chance, or they might be looking me up because they might be curious about me.
Yeah.
Conversely, I've made a decision, never to look anything up about a client, because I want to find out about my client from my client and with my client.
Sure.
Rather than, finding out any other way. So that's something that I've really made myself aware of as well. And I mean, I have seen clients out in the street at times. It doesn't happen so much, but it has happened. And it's something that I've had to think about. But what I'm saying is I wouldn't go looking for a client, if that makes sense, because I want to get to know them in the sessions that we have together and in that context.
And it's an interesting one. You said your modality would mean that you wouldn't necessarily disclose things. So in terms of relationship status, children, those sorts of things, it wouldn't, if a client do people ask you? Have you been asked about things like that?
Yeah, they might ask me about that, or even sort of throwaway comments about where I'm going on holiday, or whether I'm going to take, what I might be doing in a break. And I think it's something that you sort of learn with experience to deal with in a way. I mean, in my case, in a way that sort of fits with my modality. And I think I'd always think about it in terms of they're curious about something, and I'd be curious about that. So they're asking for a reason, and I'd be interested about that. And sometimes it's really it's led to us kind of being able to sort of think about something very important together. Where they, however throwaway their comment might be, that it does speak to a curiosity on their part about me, but that might say more about them than about me, if you see what I mean.
Sure. I mean, it's slightly more complicated in some ways for me, in that people come to my house. So there are certain things that will be clear from my house, really, about potentially my marital status, those sorts of things, that I'm unlikely to live here on my own. I suspect people would know that. Added to that, I have voluntarily come on to social media. I will be, on LinkedIn sometimes, less so on Facebook, a little bit on Instagram, which I quite like. Twitter, I was on, and now I think every time I go on, I come off almost immediately. There are some therapists on there, in terms of the kind of things that they would say. I remember, anyway, it's not really for me necessarily. Of course, there's my own well-being psychologically, but it's always thinking, isn't it, as you've said, that clients, potential clients, but also existing clients might be looking, and those two things can't be separated. Just because I might be on Instagram thinking I'm putting up a picture which Instagram followers would like, that can be clients too, can't it? And they might find something out or see something which they might find difficult or struggle with. From the point of view as well, it can be difficult for a client in that situation, because they're not able to talk about it then. It would have to wait till the next session. And also, some people just may not. They might hold something, hear something, which they would struggle to talk about. I have put in my framework agreement or contract that I am on social media, and that if anything does come up, then hopefully we can talk about that during sessions. But equally, I'm very mindful about what I put on there.
it sounds like you certainly are, and that you clearly are thinking about it to the point where you maybe you've said something to your potential clients or your new clients about the fact that you are on social media, and you're sort of saying it can be thought about with me. I mean, I guess some things are a choice that you make, and some things aren't. I mean, where you live and the fact that you might live near clients that you've working with or have worked with, in a way you can't help that. But I think the important thing either way is that you're thinking about it. And you're very aware of that. And I guess, as and when things come up, you'll continue to think about it and, maybe take it to supervision if you need to, or think with a client about it. And to me, that feels like ethical practice. So it's not always about, there are some things that are sort of do's and don'ts. And there are other things that, you have to kind of work out what it means to you, which you can do, for yourself and, with the support of your supervisor or your peer supervisees. And again, it sort of comes back to the fact that it's an ongoing thing and things change, right? And you might post something you haven't posted before, and then something different might happen, which means you have to think about it in a different way.
Sure. And I think there are two things that can make it more difficult as well, in that I can see that, even on LinkedIn now, it would be those sort of longer posts which start with an opening quote, which is somehow a bit controversial, or is a complaint about something, or that those will be the things that tend to get the most clicks. So there's something about the kind of algorithm, I think, that encourages people to do or say something which is more controversial or very personal. And I do think it's a bit different for therapists often, isn't it, as to the extent to which we kind of engage.
Yeah, and maybe one thing I'm hearing now as well, or the connection I'm making is that, maybe particularly in relation to social media and specific platforms, including Insta and LinkedIn, that new therapists setting up in private practice, they want to market themselves as well, and that they may be doing that through some of those platforms. And if you're going to market yourself through social media, you want your post to get noticed. So I guess what you're talking about here is a question around how do we do that. And we have to think about that both in terms of making ourselves visible and advertising ourselves if that's what we decide to do, but also being aware that there are ethical considerations to take into account, and that might not always be straightforward. It's not something I've done. I haven't marketed myself on social media. I've used directories and referrals from colleagues mainly. And I'm also aware that sometimes past clients might talk about me and recommend me. But I'm also aware that there are plenty of therapists and counselors who do use social media to advertise. So in those cases, or if anyone's thinking about doing that, I'd recommend that they think about it. You can read the ethical codes, and certainly in the case of the BPC, as I said, there's reference to that. I'm not sure the extent to which it's talked about by the other bodies, but you can talk to a supervisor, and I'm aware that membership organisations like the BACP also offer I think helplines where members can sort of call and put questions to them. And sort of offer that kind of support, because quite often there are sort of grey areas and people need to think about them for themselves, but they can do that with support, I guess.
Because of course, a website or a directory entry can be pretty carefully created. You have control over that, don't you? What you write. One of the things that can be difficult is a podcast. I edit this, so I would decide in some ways what goes out. But if you're a guest on somebody else's podcast, you then in some ways lose control over the editing process. I know somebody that went on she was on television on some reality show, and she was a therapist on that, but she insisted that she was had control of the editing process. She sat next to the editor when they were going through her scenes, just because a word or something, a comment, even something offhand, or the way something is deliberately edited could have caused her a difficulty. So I think that being in the media, those things can bring up other considerations, can't they? A lot of therapists I see on Counselling Directory and also BACP have a PR person, UKCP have somebody who does PR, so offers those media opportunities to therapists, and they're often very popular. The thing that I would say about that is I have done some of that. There's never been a journalist who has sort of deliberately tried to paint me in a difficult light. They want to put an article out there or piece out there which is helpful for people, and it's in their interest that they have experts, so to speak, who they make sound good in some ways. I have on one occasion there was an article that I contributed to in a magazine about Andrew Tate, actually, you know, on what would they be called? Alpha males.
Well, the toxic masculinity.
Exactly. And I did an interview with, but when I read what was in quotes, I hardly recognized any of that. She didn't say anything that I wouldn't be happy with being out there, and that's rare. But it was a situation where I was just conscious of the fact you do lose a bit of control if you do agree to go into.
I guess fundamentally
it's the journalist.
I think, but I think the same applies to social media. I mean, you know, I've been on, you know, groups on Facebook where I've, you know, asked a question meaning it one way and people have misunderstood it or misinterpreted it. So I think, you know, it's really, really important to remember that people can read things in a different light than you meant it, or hear things in a different light. And, you know, you don't always have the, you know, the right to reply, as it were. And, I mean, on Facebook you do, because there's often a conversation, and that can be really kind of productive, I think, often and useful. But, you know, you don't, if you put a podcast out, or you don't know who's going to hear it, or, you know, do an interview and it goes out in an article, you don't know who's going to read it and what they're going to think of it. At the same time, I'm really glad to hear you say what you're saying now about, you know, engaging with interviews, because I think, you know, particularly maybe going back to what we were talking about at the beginning in relation to the articles that were out there, you know, those were, you know, rightly focused on transgressions and unethical practice and real damage that has been done to people by practitioners who, it sounds like, you know, weren't working ethically at all, and you know, were doing a great deal of damage. But I think, you know, one of the things that I've sort of thought since reading that, and also talked about with colleagues, is that you know, and rightly that those stories have come to light. But, you know, what you don't really get is stories where people talk about how you know, how useful therapy has been as much, or how ethically someone has been working, you know, in a way that's, you know, maybe harder to kind of come to. So I think it's really important that therapists are also talking about therapy in a sort of positive light, because it does obviously help a great deal of people. I think there were some figures quoted in one of the articles which said that 5 to 8% of people don't find therapy useful. That means, you know, the other, you know, 95 to 92% do find it helpful, but maybe that's less of a headline, understandably, because it's obviously, you know, the negative cases will rightly draw attention, but that may be overlooked. And, you know, there are a great number of therapists who take ethical practice really, really seriously, and they work really hard to do the best by their clients in all the ways that we've sort of touched on. And I think it's really important to sort of to be talking about that, as well as, you know, the cases where things go wrong. And you seem to be doing that, so I'm really pleased about that. It's partly why I'm on this podcast as well, because I think it's really important that we do this work, and it's you know, important that, you know, more people are choosing to do it and go on to work with clients who need the help. And, you know, what we're doing here as part of that we're sort of supporting, hopefully, people listening to this, just to sort of draw attention to things that they want to be, they may want to be aware of, or should be aware of, so that they start thinking about ethical practice as they set up in private practice themselves.
Yes, and of course it's all free advice as well, isn't it? That's the thing about these platforms, is people can access things without a cost. I also think, from the point of view of therapists being on social media and in the media, someone's going to be giving that psychological advice. You know, my daughter at 18 is scrolling through TikTok all the time, and if qualified therapists are not on there doing that, she's going to be looking at something that somebody's saying. So I think I'm glad that therapists do go onto it. The thing that I would say, I think it's important to know who you are, and to sort of maintain that sense no matter what happens.
And that goes back to the thing we were talking about around being aware that, you know, if you're online, if you're going on social media, if you're appearing, you know, in other ways, that it really matters to think about, what you're saying and how you come across and what you're talking about and to what end. And, you know, that is about, you know, being thoughtful about your presence online for exactly the reasons that you're kind of underlining again now. Yes,
it's a big subject. I mean, as ever with all of these things, with people who are listening, it would be great to hear what they say about that. As I say, I think it's something that comes through a lot more from people starting out their practices. So people's views, opinions, I'd be really interested to hear that below the video as well. But I mean, just moving on perhaps to continuing professional development being an obligation as well, which we all have for very good reason. I've done conversations with other therapists before, and of course there is an obligation to do it. As I say, there are a particular number of hours for UKCP. I think it's 50 a year, but most people would exceed that because, of course, one of the amazing things about being in this profession is the fact that things are changing all the time. There are always new things to learn. It's not really possible in even a 5-year part-time diploma, which is what I did, 4-year part-time and a foundation course to sort of teach all the ideas that are out there. So that's a wonderful thing about CPD. Most people who are in the profession just are interested in the area, aren't they? And the great thing about CPD is it can be podcast, reading, in terms of transpersonal CPD, it can be retreats, all kinds of things can be included under that CPD. The other thing that I would say about that as well, I did another video about things I wish I knew before I became a therapist. I think it was that one. I'll put a link to the right video here. But I was talking about in that the concept of deliberate practice. It is that practice that, say, sports people have, where they will, say, a tennis player who will look at his backhand or her, or forehand, if that's the right phrase, and improve their performance by looking at what might be a potential flaw or deficit. The thing that I would say about CPD with therapists, including myself, is that what I would mostly do is look at what I would be interested in learning, perhaps also if clients are coming through. And I think that's an area where I don't have a huge amount of expertise, perhaps to do some more in that. But I thought that was an interesting idea. I had a podcast it was a therapist actually talking to somebody else about this idea of deliberate practice. So looking at something which might be, weakness is the wrong word, and do CPD from that point of view as well, because I'm not sure, going back to the personality types of therapists, I think we are generally very supportive. I mean, open and honest people, but generally very supportive and encouraging as well. And also, we're not in the room with the person when they're with clients. So I just, that also bearing in mind that more critical, I don't want to, not in a negative way, but looking at how we're doing in a way that, you know, what could I develop more in as well? I don't know how people decide their CPD, but I don't know if that's less around for people. It certainly was for me, I would say.
So I don't know enough about the deliberate practice in a sort of formal sense. So I've written it down. I'm going to go and Google it because it's really interesting. But maybe to that, to the point I'm making there, like, I'm curious. So I've just heard you say something there that I don't quite understand or know enough about, and I want to find out about it. So I think, you know, sure, I think, you know, we can, of course, we can identify shortcomings, or we might, you know, make mistakes that we want to address. Or it might just be that we feel we sort of, there's something else that we could find out more about, and that, you know, that might enrich our practice. I think, you know, in any case, for me, I see CPD more as a kind of an opportunity rather than an obligation. In any case, you know, I'm aware that all of it's good for my practice, and I'm curious and I want to learn more. And I think we touched on this in the last recording we did on you know, portfolio careers. And, you know, part of my motivation for doing different things is that I like learning something new. And, you know, one of the lovely things about this work is that there's always an opportunity to learn something new and to, you know, broaden practice or deepen practice. And there are so many ways you can take that. You know, I mean, it might be that someone decides to do a supervision training, or that they, you know, train in a new modality that they kind of integrate into their practice, or just find out more generally about the history of, you know, psychotherapy, which is, you know, something I'm really, really interested in and sort of do and see as part of my kind of more general CPD. So there are so many ways that, you know, we can take this, and in a way it's all useful and it's all relevant. Maybe some of it more directly and some of it, you know, less directly, but it all kind of helps us to kind of do the work that we do. And as you say, to, you know, develop as practitioners and ultimately as people as well. You know, we all decide to do in very personal ways. We all decide to do this work, I think, for personal reasons, and, you know, that's to do with us then. And, you know, we're people involved in this work as well, and there's an opportunity for us to grow as people, sort of through this work and alongside this work, which I sort of see CPD as part of as well. In a way, I'm thankful that we're, you know, required to do CPD, because it takes me into things that, you know, I find really interesting, and sometimes things that I wasn't expecting to find out about, and I'm sort of thankful for that as well. So, you know, I might sometimes do a training where I really just don't know much about something, and I've heard it, you know, talked about, and I'm like, that sounds really interesting. I'll just go and find out more about that, and, you know, do some training or some reading around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great from that point of view, as you say, to be seen as an opportunity, really. The guidance on for my CPD, they do say, please don't see this as if you're getting reaccredited and you have to put your CPD, don't see it as a defensive process, because people will say, oh God, have I done my 50 hours kind of thing, but it's looking at it in terms of opportunity and growth, isn't it? But we have a natural defensiveness possibly as well, human beings, that if we haven't met the number of hours, we might get a bit concerned about that. But it's trying to view it through that frame of, which is very easy to do. There's so many interesting things out there, and the ability to do it online and all of those things now. As I say, there's so many things that can count as CPD podcasts.
I imagine this conversation counts as CPD.
I hope so. It's going down in my my next.
You must be clocking up a huge amount of CPD hours, way above and beyond what you need to do.
That's my primary driver for my YouTube channel. And moving on a bit in terms of timing wise, paying attention to self-care as a key. It will be taken. It will be covered by a number of these probably, but the importance of that. Anything that you would say about that?
Yeah, well, I've been trying to ask people more about how they think about ethical practice and sort of maybe where their blind spots are, and that's in relation to in a way this sort of sideline this extra thing I do in my portfolio career, which is not just around clinical wills, but really an interest in seeing how else we could use tech to support people, to practitioners, to work more ethically. And as part of that, I've been asking people how they think about ethical practice, and what it is they find easy to do and what they find harder to do. And one of the things that sort of has come up again and again as in a way most likely to be overlooked is the kind of the self-care aspect. And I think it's there in the ethical codes, but maybe it's sort of the last thing that we pay attention to is how we are as people who are practicing as therapists and counselors. So we pay a lot of attention to our clients, rightly, and to the way we work with them, but maybe it's easier to kind of forget that we have to look after ourselves as well. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody, whether it's to do with I don't know, looking after myself when I'm ill, or I don't know, getting enough sleep, or even diet or exercise, and that's before we come to my own mental health. All of those things are really important, and important parts of how we make sure we're competent really to do the work on an ongoing basis, not just in terms of a qualification or number of years of experience, but sort of day to day.
Yes.
We have the kind of the energy and the mindset and the capacity to do the work, and there are so many facets to that, really. You mentioned other ones like the number of clients we might have. I'm really aware of that, and my practice is now sort of the right size for sort of all the things I do and the way my personal and professional life interact. I've thought about that very, very carefully, so that's a big part of how I look after myself. But some of those other things I mentioned are probably where I tend to overlook, how I look after myself. So again, good reminder to pay attention to that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it would be in the kind of clients I would work with, I would say. I also limit my client numbers. I also now take a week off every 6 weeks, actually, which sort of hits school holidays and those kind of things. So that's been a very helpful thing to do, actually. And as with all these things, when we're talking about the agreement, as long as clients are aware of it at the outset, I've never had anybody say that they have any difficulty with that. Working within limits of competence is another thing as well, isn't it? In the way of self-care too, just to maybe finish off on that, because when I was looking at those Guardian articles, one of them talked about how some people are working outside of their limits of competence, doing things like, for example, diagnosis. So I think some people have had some complaints because they might diagnose sort of ADHD, autistic spectrum, narcissism, that kind of thing. And I did think it was interesting reading it, because those kind of things, they come up a lot in my experience during therapy, whether that may be the client themselves talking about it, talking about other people. And I can really see that kind of not temptation, but how easy it would be to talk about somebody else's narcissism, for example. And it's a very interesting reminder, those sorts of articles, to say that, of course, we don't know them. Of course, there are indicators, aren't there? There are general themes that we are aware of as part of the training, but there isn't, in terms of ethics, to diagnose something, including anxiety or depression, although we
Yeah.
work with them all the time, we're not the people that diagnose them. And for that to be, I think it can be a difficult one to navigate, actually.
I think it can. I think, one of the things to bear in mind here is that, in a way, because people are more psychologically minded, and because, there are more people going to therapy, and in a way, the language of therapy has kind of entered, the vernacular, as you might say, more and more. So people,
Yeah.
are aware of terms like projection or narcissism, or, obviously depression, anxiety. They can relate to their own feelings. And you're absolutely right. Those things might be talked about, in everyday life, but also in the therapy room. And there is a distinction there in terms of making a diagnosis. And I think it reminds me that one of the ways I think about ethical practice is that it's about knowing what you're sort of there to do, but also knowing what you're not there to do.
Sure.
I'm trained to work in a certain way. I'm trained to work psychodynamically. I'm trained to work in once weekly therapy, and that's how I work. I'm not trained to diagnose, so I don't, but I do know that there are people who are qualified to do that. And so I can talk to my clients about that, if they, have a question around, their mental health in terms of diagnosis, or, often people are now thinking about not just depression, anxiety, but, ADHD, I think a lot of people are thinking about. And if they have a question about that, part of my, what I might do with them is to help them, access somebody who can make a formal diagnosis or explore that further with them. So that, maybe that's how I would think about that with the client.
Sure.
And the same, going back to what we were talking about before, the same would relate also apply to risk, for example. So there are certain there are cases that are in terms of risk or complexity that are, I think, beyond what I'm trained to do. So I won't work with those people. I might help them to access the right support, as part of an assessment. But ultimately, I know where my limits are as well, and I think that's a really, really important part of ethical practice, is sort of knowing what you can do and what you can't do, and bringing that into the work and into the thinking with a client.
Definitely.
But that might include a referral to someone else, or reminding them that there are certain things that they could or should go and speak to their GP about if they're worried about it.
Yeah. Yes.
I often find myself, thinking about things in those terms with clients.
Yeah. So, we can talk about the principles, just not diagnosing something, which is important to hold on to, isn't it?
Important, obviously, because, that again, it comes back to the fundamental sort of principle of ethical practice, which is it's about, the well-being and really, related to that, the safety of our clients. And, knowing what we can do and what we can't do is a really important part of that. And the final bit, I'm repeating something I've said throughout this, this conversation as well, that, that there might be times when we're not sure about that. And in those instances, that's where we have supervision, and, whether that's, the individual kind of vertical supervision, as you called it, or the, the more horizontal peer supervision. There are people who, and this is why it's in the ethical codes, we are set up to have that support, so that when we are in doubt and we do have a question, we can go and think about it with someone else who's, qualified and appropriate to do that thinking with us, and to give us advice if we need it. And that's why we do supervision, partly.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour.
There's a lot to cover, isn't there?
But, there's so much more that we can talk about, I imagine.
I'm sure.
But, any reflections you would have, and it may just be what you were saying there, any reflections you would have about ethics? And
yeah, I think it's just reminding me that, firstly, there is a lot to think about. You picked up something there in relation to deliberate practice, which I hadn't sort of heard about. So I'm really interested in that. I'm just curious about that. So really, I think what I'm sort of really reminded of there is that there's always more to think about. And, we can never really stop thinking about it. There's always more to learn, obviously. And it's also just worth sort of checking in with, all the things we've kind of touched on as really important. I might go and check my, my insurance and what that cover actually is at the point when I renew, or, from time to time, checking my agreements, or thinking about how I communicate those with my clients, or, if something changes in relation to the data protection laws, just making myself aware of that and incorporating that. And, just talking to people when I need to, and also sharing my advice, really. I've a lot of what we've talked about, I've shared with other colleagues who've asked me about it. And there's that sort of, that part of ethical practice, which is sort of, doing the best we can for, our profession as therapists and counselors, and supporting each other, and really, even in small ways, making sure that we're helping other practitioners do the work well and ethically, which, is kind of good for everyone, mainly the clients, obviously, but, good for the profession as a whole, which, you know,
Absolutely.
ultimately benefits the client.
Yeah, which is what we all want, I guess. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I mean, hopefully
right.
It's been helpful and interesting for people. As ever, if anybody has any comments, please do comment below the video. I'd love to hear from you, and perhaps, you know, we can do some future videos about anything that people want to talk about. But also, as ever, please do like or share the video if you have found it helpful, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But Michael, a final thank you. That was amazing. Really appreciate it. And yeah, you take care.
Thanks, John Paul. Take care. Bye-bye.